Again, thank you. What an incredible panel, high-powered group of people. My head is buzzing from that and some of the many other previous discussions, but it is now my very great pleasure to introduce our last and final guest, Arturo Bejar. Arturo and I sat on this stage 10 years ago this month when we had the FOSI 2014 European Forum. And at that time, you were, what was the role what was your title?
I was the head of Protect and Care
at
Facebook.
Right. And we had a discussion about some work that you were doing with Yale University and Mark Brackett, who was here, and it was called Compassionate Research. Tell us what Compassionate Research was and what was its legacy within Facebook?
Yeah. So one of the things that we realized in 2010 was who are we as product managers or engineers who mean well, but really don't have the expertise to create interventions that help teenagers deal with bullying and harassment or whatever they might be dealing with online. I mean, we know how to build products, but we didn't know the other part. And that was clear because for the bullying and reporting flows, we had a 10% completion rate. And so when we started reviewing the reports, what we found is that when you looked at the content that teens were reporting, it wasn't really clear what was going on. So we brought together a number of teens and asked them, what's going on, can you please tell us? And we learned a lot from just listening to them, and that's what the work became about. The compassion work was to understand the harm that people experience and to provide them tools that help with that. And so in the context of teens, what you would do is ask them what kinds of bad experiences do you have, and they would tell you, somebody's spreading rumors about me, somebody's threatening me, all these things. And we went from using the language of bullying and harassment, which none of the teens related to options that were somebody spreading rumors about me, these things. We knew, again, 10 years ago that the word report is something that they don't like because they're worried that they or somebody else is going to get in trouble. So we changed the language to I don't want to see this, and we saw a tripling of the use of the tools based on just changing that prompt.
Wow.
And the last thing I'll say about that is when we were here, the goal was to talk about taking what we had learned from listening to teens in the US and localize all over the world. So we had a team in Singapore, we had teams in France, teams in Spain that talked to teens, and then we adapted the language and the experience based on what they were dealing with.
Okay. Just explain a little bit about the kind of language or the prompts that you injected into the process and how that changed teens' behaviors.
Yeah, so when we talk to teens, one of the things that we found is that most frequently, people are being annoying, like 75%. And so we had an option that allowed you to say, so-and-so is being annoying. And then how annoying are they? Like really annoying or just a little bit annoying. And in that context, it is appropriate to reach out to the other person and say, please stop being annoying, right? And we provided default messaging that was crafted so that it would help them. And most people sent messages with the default messaging that we provided because we wanted to make it easy. At the same time, somebody could say, somebody's threatening me and I'm feeling very afraid. And in that context, we learned back then that the single most important thing is that for a teen not to feel alone. So based on an intense emotion, we asked them what emotion they were experiencing and the kind of issue, they would get customized guidance that was, oh, find somebody that you trust, reach out to them. If you don't, here's some helplines. Because the goal of a bullying and reporting flow is not to get the content to be judged and removed. The goal of that is to make the teen feel supported at the time that they're experiencing and they're distressed.
So, give us, you're a facts and figures guy. Give us some stats. What was the reaction? How did things go up? Did things go down? What happened?
Yeah, so the first version of the flows, which asked teens if they were getting bullied and harassed, this is 13 to 15, had a 10% completion rate. When we changed the language to account for what teens were experiencing, the intensity of the emotion, and provided them a custom response, the completion rate went to 82%. Because most people, when they hit the report button, they want help. and they want you as a company to understand what they're experiencing. And the other really important statistic was that 60% of the teens that used the tools that we provided felt better after using the tools. Because if you think about what happens, and this applies to all of us, like you're sitting in a room full of people, and you get a distressing text message, you see a post or somebody sent an email with a big CC list, you're alone like that. Doesn't matter how many people are there. And in a young brain, that is felt more intensely. And so the capacity to allow somebody to say, can you please help me, validate their experience, allow them to name their feelings, and then give them actions that are appropriate based on that, teens appreciate it because they felt supported and understood. And I do want to say that on one of the things that we found that was very surprising from a data perspective is for teens that told us the most intense emotions, very afraid, very angry, like the kind of bullying you read in the news about, we looked at the content. And of 10,000 pieces of content that we reviewed, half of them was, Stephen, after the forum is over, I'm going to kick your ass. And you can get discernibility that allows a third party to say, yeah, it makes sense. But the other half of the most intensely felt content was, oh, I really love your glasses. They're so fantastic. I love that jacket. It's so cool. And when you have to look at these things, it turns out that in the context of, for example, bullying and harassment, it might be somebody who got teased at school in the morning, who's experiencing extreme distress at being commented about publicly, and you want to help those the same than the ones where there is discernibility of the content. But I mean, if you're working on bullying and harassment, one of the things you need to know is the content is not going to be discernible, so then you have to focus on making a teen feel supported at the time that they ask for help.
Great. Okay. By the way, for what it's worth, I really like your glasses. No, I do. I want to find out. Well, we'll talk later. Yeah. So this was 2015. Full disclosure: Facebook was a member of FOSI at the time. I sat on the Safety Advisory Board since 2009. I am no longer on the board, nor is Facebook any longer a member of FOSI for reasons I can discuss over a drink. In the meantime, you left about a year later. Is that right?
Yeah.
For family reasons.
For family reasons.
And you have how many kids do you have?
I have 2.
Okay, because I bring up the kids because the kids influence, as it were, the next phase. Do you want to describe that?
Yeah, so I left in 2015. These tools that we talked about, the compassion tools, were being used by around 100 million people a month at the time.
Wow.
And the idea was to help people navigate issues and resolve issues with each other, right? And where appropriate, provide other resources. So I left, the team was in good shape, it was called Protect and Care. I went to focus being a parent, and when my daughter turned 14, it was time for her to join Instagram. And look, my goal when I was working in industry was to provide an environment where I felt good having my kids and everybody else's kids using the product. Mm. And within a few months of her going into Instagram, she came to me crying, and she was like, Dad, I made a post about cars. She loves cars. And somebody told me to get back to the kitchen. Or even worse, somebody commented on one of my body parts. And she's like 14. And I'm like, what did you do? So I tried reporting it. And what happened? I didn't get any help. All these things that were getting told to me that were deeply distressing was not get any help from reporting, not violate community standards.
So your work was no longer being a part of the process?
No. So then I began looking, and it turned out that in a few years after I left, all of the compassion work, all of the lessons learned in building flows for teens, which we presented about publicly, we had all of the statistics on usage, all of the statistics, the kind of transparency we're trying to extract from companies now through legislation, we did voluntarily. There was no negative press around it because there was goodwill work to fix it. All that work was gone, deleted, removed. And what she had to deal with instead is when she got an unwanted advance, which at 14 she got from peers, right? Again, it's not that much about predators. There was nothing she could do. The options she had were reporting pornography, but that's not, I mean, if you comment about my glasses and it makes me uncomfortable because I think you're coming on to me, I should be able to say, well, it's not for me, right? Mm. She had no tools to help. The only thing she could do was block. And when I asked her, how does that work for you and for the others, she said, the boys, they just laugh it off, right? They just move on to the next person.
All right. So you have this very negative experience with your daughter. It's personal because it's related to your previous work, which is no longer being utilized. And what? You call up Facebook and say, hey?
Yep.
Wow. So how did that go? What was that conversation like?
So what happened was the head of my research team in Protect and Care became the head of research for Instagram, and was instrumental on like Daisy and other key things like that. And he said, "Oh, you should come help us with the work." I met the head of engineering for what's called the well-being team in Instagram, which is a team in charge of all the bad stuff that happens on Instagram. And it turns out that they had no memory of any of the work that had been done 4 years earlier. Oh. And they invited me in as an industry expert to help them kind of remember that work and to provide support to the product managers that were building products to help teens and people who use Instagram deal with the issues that they were facing.
So that's good, right? So you get in there. How long were you in there working with them again?
I was there for 2 years.
And what was the job? What were you actually doing?
I was talking with product managers and engineers and user research and all of the functions that go into making a product to try and understand the harms that people were experiencing and what are the product interventions that helped. And as I get into the darker side of this, I want to say that I have nothing but respect and admiration for the people who work in trust and safety, in the well-being teams that have these functions for the company. But what happened was, in the experience of my daughter, you know, it should not be acceptable for a 13, 14, 15-year-old, or really anybody, to get an unwanted advance over their DMs. And so I wanted to set a goal saying, can we please reduce that based on what people are experiencing? And I had a very simple product intervention that would be easy to build that would make it better. And I could not get the goal to stick on the review process as it went up management. So instead, I got resources to say, can you please help us understand the harm that people are experiencing in Instagram? Because what was happening is they weren't doing the work to reduce. I mean, they knew about teenagers' body image issues and girls, and they weren't shipping products around it. They knew about like addiction and people spending way too much time on their phones and how many notifications they get at night, hundreds of times. Weren't doing anything about it. And it was the goal-setting process and the company kind of working on these issues that was preventing this from happening. So at that point, I decided, because again, a little bit of my background, I started as the first engineer that Yahoo hired to work on security. I became their chief of security, so I was a CISO. I was reporting to the C-suite team, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, all these issues for 6 years on all of the issues that we're talking about here. I would set the strategy for that. And so my job when I became aware of a material issue that was impacting the users of a company was to research, make recommendations, and respectfully bring it to the attention of the executives, having vetted it with the organization.
Right. So tell us about the chain of events that led you to reach to the C-suite and then eventually leave again. How did that work out?
So, and I believe, by the way, these numbers are the same that they were when we did the research, and they had been the same for years before. So the thought was, let's understand the harm that people are experiencing by asking them, like, have you received an unwanted advance in the last 7 days? Right? 13% of 13 to 15-year-olds, AKA kids, said, yes, I received an unwanted advance in the last 7 days, primarily on messaging. Have you more than 7 days? 1 in 3. Have you been the target, right? Like, has anyone done any of these to you on Instagram? Insulted you or disrespected you, contacted you inappropriately, damaged your reputation, threatened you, right? And just imagine how a 13-year-old experiences these things. 11% experienced it in the last 7 days. 27% saw it happen, as they did with my daughter, and the company would do nothing about it, normalizing the behavior, because the thing that's really toxic about the unwanted advances or bullying and harassment or unwanted content is that if the company does not act on them, it normalizes the behavior. And please note that by values, I believe in freedom of expression, and nothing I ever advocate reduces the capacity of that. Have you seen sexual images that you didn't want to see? 20% in the last 7 days. Have you seen self-harm content? right? In the context of Molly Rose and teens that commit suicide on a feed of self-harm content, 8.4% in the last 7 days. And so these are material numbers of harm that were experienced by teenagers. And what I did is I went to every manager asking the
And
same
I'm sorry to
questions.
interrupt. Is this U.S. only, or is this
Global.
Global.
Hundreds of thousands of people all
My-
over the world got surveyed.
Okay. Okay.
Okay? And I do want to, if I may,
Sure.
when we talk about data about harm, it's there. The presentation was published by the New Mexico AG. There's no caveats there. It's statistically significant, hundreds of thousands of people. It was vetted. Like it's an accurate representation on the harm our kids are experiencing today on Instagram. And so the belief was, the moment that the executive team learns about this, they will invest to reduce it. Right? That was my experience. Every time there had been a compromise, every time I became aware of people being hacked, every time there was a privacy issue, you bring it up to the attention of the executive team. They say, let's meet tomorrow. What can we do to reduce it? And so I sent all of these numbers to Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, Chris Cox, head of product, Adam Mosseri, head of Instagram. And the most heartbreaking moment was talking to the head of product. And I would do this thing that went like, how many teens experienced this particular harm in the last 7 days? And he knew off the top of his head within a couple of percentage points.
You know, it occurs to me just sitting here that both your daughter and you reported something to Facebook and were ignored, right?
That's correct, yeah.
But come on, your daughter must be proud of you, right? You took her lack of action to the source.
Yeah, when I began the whistleblowing path, the first thing I did is I talked to my kids. Because I didn't want to put them in a position that they were not comfortable in. And both of them said, Dad, just do it so that it counts.
Good for them. So I met Frances Haugen in DC a couple of months ago at a Brookings Institute event, chatted to her. How is what you've done similar and how is it different from what she did? By the way, Frances Haugen was the first Facebook whistleblower and testified to Congress. You've now testified to Congress. But where are the similarities and where are the differences in your approaches, would you say?
I think that the similarities is in putting yourself out there to talk about these things in a way where you get disavowed by the industry, right? Like right now I'm persona non grata. I lost a lot of friends and connections in the process. And I found Frances very inspiring in doing so. And in particular, for bringing to light the issues around girls and body image issues. What was unfortunate for Frances on that front is that she hadn't worked on those issues directly.
Right.
And so when she asked about it, she says, well, I don't have direct experience on that. And I think the two big differences for me is, number one, this has been the work, my life's work for the last 30 years.
Right.
And number two, I was executive, right? So I have the perspective of, like, I look at regulators in the room with great hope because I would like to offer any support that I can from the perspective of if you could talk to the executives that run these things and get honest answers about what the capacities are of the company, what kind of data or goals will set a difference. I can do that in a way that Frances cannot because she was not as senior as I was.
Okay, well, let's talk about not quite regulators, but AGs, Attorneys General in the United States. Talk about your work with them and how that's progressing.
So how I began my whistleblowing journey is both the AGs and the FTC compelled me to testify. So I was subpoenaed. And I decided to be the most helpful witness ever. Usually when you get trained on these things in the company,
Yes, right.
you get trained to be like, if somebody doesn't ask the perfect question, just say you don't know. Instead, what I think people should do is to say, no, here's a question you should be asking, and here's 5 people you can ask that question about. Because ultimately, the way that the industry has approached the AGs and regulation and other things, and I have shame because I bought into this for 25 years, is like the way we as Mexican kids deal with piñatas, where you blindfold the kid, you give them a stick and you spin them around, right? Companies do not today give regulators the data that they need to pass. The data is all there, the harm data is all there, the They have the processes, they have the capacity, but they don't produce that for regulators in a way that helps regulators write the best legislation that they can to reduce harm.
And I would add researchers too.
Yeah, absolutely. Like when you think about the way the industry is heading, right? The research team that did all of this work, whose job was to understand the harm that people were experiencing at scale, has now been laid off. Half of the research team at Facebook has been laid off. They stopped keeping meeting notes on these subjects, and they've been compartmentalizing meetings such that there is not an evidence trail that can be produced by a regulator when it comes time to do that. It's really, I believe that the industry has taken the worst lessons possible of Frances and from me, where what should have happened when Frances happened is an earnest conversation of like, well, how do we affect body image issues for girls? We don't initiate it. Like one of the things that came up earlier was this talk about causality in this domain. Causality in this world doesn't exist. It's like public health causality. But what you do know is you play a role, right? You play a role in polarization. You play a role in body image issues. You play a role in bullying and harassment. And the fact that you play a role gives you a responsibility to understand the role that you play and to minimize the harm that you facilitate.
Something we call the culture of responsibility. I'll show you, I'll send the graphic round. I'm particularly interested to know your reaction to the last panel and the regulatory approach that's going on in Europe and the UK, we have to say, compared to the United States. Let's just take the US for the moment. Where are they getting it right here in Europe? Where are they getting it wrong? What are we doing right in the US? What are we doing wrong?
So the way I think about it is, I find the EU to be superbly badass. I mean, they're like the
badass?
Yeah.
That's a technical term, folks.
Yeah.
You can look it up.
Whenever they enter the chat, I feel hope.
Huh.
And so recently, when there was this inquiry on mental health issues and things like that, I feel hope. I find the dialogue within Ofcom to have the best understanding so far about the limits of moderation. Because it turns out that when we think about illegal content and harmful experiences, this was in my note to Mark Zuckerberg, illegal content accounts for 0.02% of the harmful experiences people have on platforms. Why? Because the people with intent to harm adapt. We used to call them smart Nazis, right? When we were working on stuff 10 years ago, where your goal is to be anti-Semitic, but you know what's going to get your content deleted, right. So you're just to the left of that line. And if that line moves, you move with that line. And in the US, they're very early in the process, so we need to have something like COSA. The AGs need to move their work forward. And the work, if you're in the industry and you want to make this better, is to help those people understand the data and what the platforms have to do. But I will say the one thing that I think is missing across the board, which I think would be the most impactful thing that's not yet there, is to the question of how do you know the DSA is succeeding, right? Or how do you know that Ofcom is succeeding? And I think that needs to be harm as experienced by people or harms as experienced by teens. There should be a metric like the percentage of teens experiencing unwanted advances, which should apply to every product that allows messaging. And you know the regulation is working because that number starts going down. And I think the regulators and the industry should be held to that number going down, right?
Interesting.
And I believe that until that numbers are public from an operational basis, there is no incentive on the part of companies to reduce them, right?
Which is my next question. How do we incentivize the social media companies to play right? Is that purely the way, or are there other ways to incentivize them?
I mean, I think that one, you have to approach this as an adversarial relationship with the industry, because the industry values its freedom so much that they go to extraordinary lengths to try and keep as much of that freedom as they can, even at the cost of harm. So then what you have to do is figure out what are the things that would show up in a dashboard that Mark Zuckerberg looks at on a weekly or monthly basis that is a metric that would have to be driven down, because all of these companies are driven by metrics. Metrics are the incentive structures of companies. They have revenue, they have engagement, they have usage, they have goals and all of these metrics. And the question I would have for anybody from industry here is, well, what is your goal on self-harm content? What is your goal metrics-based on unwanted advances? What is your goal on disinformation or on hate, right? There will always be, it'll never be zero, but I tell you, today it's 20, 25% for kids, which is so unacceptable. And so I think that the day that Mark or any other company has to publicly say, along with earnings, the number of teenagers on Instagram that got unwanted advances is the number that you start investing into the appropriate innovation relative to impact to reduce that harm. And if you talk about, well, how does the industry think about this today? So when I talked to Adam Mosseri, the head of Instagram, after I shared the report, I had a really simple product thing that you can do, which is, for teenagers, if you get an unwanted advance, it's like somebody coming into your house, they send you a DM, and again, my daughter got many of them that were like crass sexual propositions within the first few messages. You should be able to say, that's not for me, period. And then you make them safe, you block, you deal with that, and then you record that that was an unwelcome advance. Now, if somebody does 3 unwelcome advances, one of the things about online behavior is that most of the people that do unwanted behavior do so unintentionally out of a lack of feedback or awareness. Now, there's definitely people who do it intentionally, but again, 90% we found when we studied this, people are just being humans fumbling around with each other. So you tap the person on the shoulder and you go like, hey, Pat, I understand that you really want to get laid. Maybe not use that language, but that's really what's happening. And you're like, this is, if this is not the place for that, this is not how you lead, we've gotten feedback that this stuff, so we thought you might want to know. And I built products that were based on nudging feedback that was not punitive to people, and 50 to 75% of people changed their behavior based on the nudge. Now, it turns out that that capacity to make teens comfortable to say, that's an unwanted advance, is also how you find predators, is also how you find sextortion, because the good people will stop sending unwanted advances and they'll lead with other things. And then the predators will continue doing that, so statistically they'll stick out like sore thumbs. And you say, well, why wouldn't they build that? I mean, this is easy to build. You don't have to hire content reviewers because nobody needs to look at the messages. You don't need to stand up a new machine learning infrastructure to deal with it. The reason that they didn't build it is because they don't want to know when teenagers are having unwanted advances. Hence, that number has been the same and will be the same until they get compelled to reduce it.
Okay, all right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit because we've touched on tech, we've touched on the regulators, we've looked a little bit at research, but what about parents? I mean, you sat through the first panel, I believe. You're a parent yourself. You obviously have friends who are also parents. What's missing in this parenting picture? What would most improve the parenting experience for, say, the next generation who are coming through?
So there's different answers. So within product design, one of them is defaults for parents that make their job easy, right? So today, for example, you can create an Instagram account as a 13-year-old, and you get the checkbox between public and private, and it has no text around it, no guidance, nothing. That is a huge decision. If you choose a public account, you're putting yourself at so much risk.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if you clicked on public to say, oh, go get your parents, sit down and have a conversation with them, and here's what both of you need to know if you're going to choose to walk down this path, right? Ultimately, the measure of all of these things ought to be, do they help parents and do they help kids with the issues that they're facing? If you look at parental controls, they shove too much stuff on parents today, and I have yet to ask, and maybe may I ask here, who here is a parent that has enabled parental controls with their kids and found them super helpful?
For a little while. She's 28 now.
Wow. You're the first person every time I've asked a question in a room where people have said, yeah, those have helped me.
At 13, she said, I hate your job, Dad.
Yeah, but the thing is, right, you have to design these features in a world where you kind of want to facilitate a good connection between parents and their kids to navigate what is inevitably going to come up, right? And you don't want to, like, again, And that's not how these features are designed today. I think a lot of these safety features are designed as placebo for regulators. So they can say, oh, here, look at our parental center, but they're not transparent about adoption statistics and then user experience feedback about how useful parents find it, right? And if there was transparency on how people kind of find this useful, then you can make a great product out of it because look, I believe today it's not safe to have a 13-year-old on Instagram because of the likelihood of unwanted advances, extortion, pornographic content, all these other things, in ways that I can explain that you can easily reproduce. I wish it was. Like there's no reason to expose a 13-year-old to self-harm content. There's more than enough videos to show them. By default, recommended, I'm talking about recommending services. There's no reason for a 13-year-old to get, within 8 minutes of account creation, a video where a woman talks about how great it is to be gangbanged, right? I have the videos and the testing that backs that. And so we need to get to a world where the default setting and the default experience for kids and for parents is one that makes everybody's job a little bit easier because it's going to get harder as they get older. But you want to start in a place where it's safe.
Very good point. All right, listen, let's throw it open to the audience. We've got a question over here. Everything you ever wanted to ask Arturo Bejar? And if you could say who you are?
Sure. Does that work?
Nope. Try again. Just
Now?
There we go.
Okay. So Arturo, first, thank you very much for what you did and for who you are. Stephen, thank you for this wonderful conversation.
And remind us who you are?
Itai Brezis, I lead corporate development in ActDefense. I wanted to ask you, we heard from the regulators in the prior session that fines are not a measure of success for regulation. And we know from other industries that fines do work. In financial services, for instance, fines have caused banks to do things that they never would have done if they didn't have those fines. And when you were talking about metrics that need to be followed, the guidance from DSA today is, as we heard, very risk-based and not very directive in terms of these metrics. So is the answer to change that approach, or is the answer to actually do have very strict fines in order to make these companies change the way that they operate?
In the 30 years I was in industry, the only time I saw meaningful change in internal behavior was with an FTC consent decree, which changed how the company operated. Other than that, like the companies were very resilient at some of the things that they were receiving. Now, the EU has some such spectacular fines that I hope they act as an economic incentive. Again, a huge fan. But I do believe that, again, I can tell you over drinks how as the former executive in charge of security and these things, how I can comply with most audits, how I can navigate a lot of compliance requirements. But what I couldn't game if I was on the inside was if I had to ask my users, did you experience this? What did you think to do? And then the other question, which ought to be a gold standard, when something bad happens to you, do you know what to do about it and does it help you? Like agency, right? That I couldn't game, right? In the same way that revenue cannot really be gamed, it's very hard, and the structure to keep the integrity of revenue works really well. I think the change, I hope, for all regulators should be to, at least within their transparency framework, not have things like, for example, what Facebook calls prevalence, which is grade your own homework. I will define what bad content is, and I will tell you how bad I am at removing it, which then incentivizes me to focus on the content I can remove. It's to be based on, well, how many teens get unwanted advances, right? How good I am at dealing with sextortion when it comes up. How good I am at discovering new harms when they happen, right? And these things can be codified into metrics that then if you had leaderboards, then it gets really good, because I can tell you that TikTok's amazing at not showing pornographic content to teenagers. Well, that's not the case of Instagram, right? And if you began having that kind of transparency of experience, then you would get competition to do its thing. But without that transparency, which Ofcom, the DSA, and the US need to do, I have a hard time thinking how long it's going to take for my daughter to stop getting unwanted advances over Instagram. and your kids.
Great, thanks. Yes, this question here.
Thank you. Thank you, Arturo, for being here. I must say, this session has been the most refreshing session I've heard today.
Sorry, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Of course. My name's Laura Wyatt-Smith. I'm currently writing a book for parents on the topic of smartphones, and I'm a Churchill Fellow, having done some non-academic research on this topic. I think a lot of the messaging that I've heard today is about how difficult it is to make the internet a safer place for children and young people. I have 20 years experience working in the children and youth sector in the UK, and we design services and experiences for children and young people by default. We always involve the youth voice in our decision making. We always have panels. We always consult them from the word go. And what strikes me today is that children and young people feel like an afterthought, and yet they are funding through the attention economy the profits of big tech. And what I'm hearing from this session is that actually there's many easy wins. I'm not saying they'll be perfect, I'm not saying they'll be watertight. I understand the complexities of international legislation, but that there are many easy wins if only the tech companies were incentivized to act on them. And I'd like to ask that question: how difficult is it to make significant steps forward? I'm not saying it will be perfect, but how difficult is it really to address this, given we were talking about this 10 years ago?
So one of the things that I found when I was talking to regulators in the UK is that social media companies, in particular Facebook and Meta, misrepresent what they're able to do. So for example, they talked about their inability to detect under 13 accounts. I was responsible for managing the team that built the world's biggest infrastructure for detecting fake accounts. You know, it's not that hard to find an account that an 8-year-old makes, right? And these are all problems that are solvable. They said, our algorithms are content agnostic. No, they're not content agnostic. They know when a teenager is doom scrolling beauty content that makes them feel worse about themselves when you ask them, and they have the capacity to nudge that into a different kind of content, right? Again, we're talking about recommendations, not when you search for things. And they have an incredible capacity to deal with spam. So what you need to do in order to meaningfully reduce these numbers is to bring to bear those tools and that infrastructure on these metrics, on recommendation services, and you need to add a few features in direct messaging that, you know, we talk about rights, which I deeply believe in. Your feed should be a safe space for you, and then should you be able to say, any teen to say, don't show me that. Why? Because it's a little porny for me, I don't want that. Your messages should be a safe space for you, and the content that you create, like my daughter on her car post, should be a safe space for her. And these are all things that don't require further proofing of research. There's plenty of data about the harms that play out through them, and you could start changing them today, but the companies are not willing to do that, so they have to be compelled.
I think we have time for one more up here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Tash Ahmed from TikTok and the Youth Safety and Wellbeing Global Policy team. Thank you so much. I've loved the candor here. My question is, could you give the non-execs here who work in tech 2 pieces of advice to keep fighting and keep challenging the status quo within tech? I know me and my colleagues work every day on these thorny issues. We're very passionate, driven, and determined. But how can we persist when we are kind of in situations where things are being challenged from top down? So I'd love to ask that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. I mean, I think that one of the things I realized when I began talking about these issues is that I really, confidentiality was something that was burned into my head in a way that was not really helpful in this case, because I cannot think of a good reason for confidentiality on matters of harm as experienced on the platforms, other than to avoid embarrassment for executives, right? And so I would hope that the level of transparency that is made safe by regulators is big enough so that then the executives are compelled to reduce this harm. So had I not come forward with these issues, we wouldn't know any of these numbers, and this harm would continue happening every 7 days. Now, if you're inside a company, the best thing I can advise to you, having spent 30 years inside industry, is to understand the incentive structures of managements, because incentive structures are the rivers that carve the world, right? And so when I was at Yahoo, I would end up doing a dashboard with colors, comparing the different units of the company, and nobody wanted to be red. Everybody hated red, and that moved mountains within Yahoo. I do think that...
Sorry, what's red? Explain that. I don't understand.
Oh, red was a color that I assigned based on how a unit was doing with regards to security.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And dashboards with colors, man, for C-suites are incredibly powerful tool. And so I think it worked. I think in the case, so you want to be able to appeal to that, but I do think that, again, in the case of TikTok, right, there ought to be transparency on harm, like self-harm content, right, like that teens are experiencing, so that you can bring the tools to bear that you have to reduce that. And it's a hard journey. I really, like, having spent many years on the inside, have a lot of respect for what it is to be policy, trust and safety, somebody who wants to make the world safer in an environment where executives don't value relative to the impact it has on its users, and especially on youth.
Yeah, yeah. In my experience, having looked and worked with a number of companies, including your own, I'm not pointing out your own, but the folks in the C-suite are often very engaged in growth and engagement. Growth, grow the numbers, and keep them engaged. And oh, but we have this team over here to take the trash out until the trash starts to overwhelm the C-suite, and then it gets their attention. So keep doing what you're doing, Tasha. You're good, doing good work. We're running out of time, and actually, I'd love to come back to your earlier point or your question, because there's a quote. I hope you don't mind me reading this out from it. He and I did not get together we couldn't speak at the same time because your travel and my travel. Anyway, but you wrote me this lovely line, and it says, there are very simple things social media companies could do, which are not a matter of cost, they're a matter of priority. So I thought that was a nice way to respond to your point. Do you mind if we spend 30 seconds on the fact that this man also works with Philip Glass? Anyone? Philip Glass, the musician? Oh, yeah. And if you put Arturo's name up with Philip Glass in YouTube, you will get a 1.5-hour spectacular masterclass of a Google Talk, right, that you did some time ago. Tell us a little bit about your collaboration and where you're heading with all of that.
Well, when I left, it was to retire and change careers in 2015, in part, and to focus on parenting. And I was lucky enough to be able to get to meet Philip Glass, who was incredibly kind and generous with his time and attention. And based on that, we did some collaborations, some films. I wrote a thing. It was on stage. I co-directed on stage. And right now, I'm working on a project around Darwin. Because one of the things that we found when we were doing the compassion
Explain
work,
the project. Excuse me. Use the word. What is it, the form that you're doing?
I wrote a libretto for an opera.
He's doing an opera on Darwin, people. What are you doing this weekend? All right.
Yeah, so one of the things that we learned when we were building the compassion tools is that in order for us to sort things out with each other, emotion plays a central role. If I pick up that you're upset, there's part of my brain that wants to help with that in a way that doesn't put me at risk, right? But it's a collaborative response. And Darwin studied that. Darwin studied the expression of emotion in men and animals and the role that it had in people connecting with each other. So I'm writing an opera that looks not just at Darwin, but at the community around him that made the ideas come out into the world, because it was his wife, who was deeply religious, just edited The Origin of the Species, and they navigated that difference in belief in a beautiful love story. Yeah. It was his best friends, his worst enemies, the people who like shamed him and accused him of the most awful things. And to try to understand sort of how you navigate these things from the lens of emotion, which is also the domain of art, and I think also of technology.
Wow. All right. Well, you send us a link to the premiere. We'd all be willing to come, wouldn't we, to see it and support you. Thank you so very, very much. I said to him I won't embarrass him, I hope I won't embarrass you, but this man is the ultimate of left brain and right brain working together, head and heart, and I would add soul, actually, after our exchange of the last 2 days. It's just been such a pleasure to be with you again, and such a beautiful human being. So please thank Arturo Bejar.
Thank you.